Hey guys, this morning we step into the quiet hush of dawn, where soft, golden light spills across your window and the air feels crisp and almost brand new. You notice how the morning sky holds its breath for a moment, as if heaven itself is waiting to see what God will write into your day. What does He have planned for you? Could today hold a conversation that changes everything, or a smile from a stranger that shifts your mood entirely? You probably won't survive this morning without at least one coffee, but that's part of the charm of waking up alive and hopeful. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments, what does your morning look like right now? Are you listening in bed, sipping tea, or maybe on your way to work? Now, take a deep breath, feel the morning light on your face, and let's begin today's prayer together. As you stand there, remember, mornings have been sacred across history. The early church fathers often rose before sunrise to pray, believing the first rays carried God's whispers. Some scholars debate whether monastic communities shaped entire daily rhythms around dawn prayers, or whether culture shaped prayer instead. Even the quirky fact that Roman roosters were considered sacred alarm clocks reminds you that people have always sought divine rhythm in morning sounds. And here you are, centuries later, standing in that same rhythm, letting God meet you at sunrise. You breathe in slowly, and the morning air feels almost like a prayer itself, cool, gentle, and full of quiet promises. As you inhale, you realize that trust is not a heavy word, but a fresh rhythm. Like the rise and fall of your chest, you hand over your scattered thoughts, your to-do lists, and your hidden anxieties to God, because He has already written the story of this day. The early light reminds you that His mercies are new every morning, and you don't have to carry yesterday's burdens into today. You open your heart like an empty cup, ready for Him to pour peace and strength into every corner. Across history, believers have greeted the morning with acts of trust. The ancient Israelites gathered manna in the dawn, a symbol that God provides just enough for each day. Historians still argue whether this was more about sustenance or a lesson in dependence, but the point remains: dawn teaches trust. And here's a quirky detail: medieval Christians often placed prayer stones by their doorways, tiny markers to remind them to release worry before stepping out. You might not have a stone, but you do have this moment. You stand in the morning light, breathing deeply, surrendering everything into God's capable hands. The soft hum of morning grows richer as the birds begin their chorus, and you notice how their songs feel, almost like a choir, rehearsed just for you. Each chirp is a reminder that creation worships without anxiety, that every creature lifts its voice because God sustains them. You join quietly with your own heart, letting your thoughts turn into prayer, not polished or perfect, but honest and alive. As you listen to the gentle sounds around you, you realize prayer isn't about long speeches. It's about leaning into God's presence with the same natural ease as the robin on your fence. In early Christian tradition, morning hymns were sung not just to honor God, but to align hearts with the rising sun. Some monasteries believed the very vibrations of voices carried healing for weary souls. Historians still argue whether these chants were meant more for personal devotion or community bonding. Yet their legacy endures. Here's a quirky note. Some medieval churches trained nightingales to sing near the altar, believing their melodies stirred deeper prayer. Imagine that. And now, you hear the morning outside your own window. No nightingale, perhaps, but the Spirit reminding you that prayer can ride on the wings of song. You lift your heart with them, steady, hopeful, present. The sunlight begins to stretch across the floor, painting golden paths that remind you of blessings you sometimes forget to count. Gratitude flows best in mornings like this, when the world is still fresh and your heart is tender enough to notice. You whisper thanks for breath in your lungs, for the people who love you, and for the unseen mercies that carried you here. Gratitude doesn't erase your struggles, but it reframes them, giving you courage to see God's goodness even in small, ordinary details. The warmth of your cup, the softness of your pillow, the way the morning breeze brushes against your cheek. For centuries, Christians have begun their days with thanksgiving. Early church liturgies often placed psalms of praise before any petitions. Believing gratitude opened the soul to deeper faith. Historians still argue whether this sequence was strictly theological or simply practical, yet its beauty remains. And here's a quirky fact. In 17th century England, some families kept gratitude journals tied with ribbon, where even children wrote blessings before breakfast. You may not have ribbon or parchment today, but your heart can still record its thanks. As the sun climbs higher, you let every ray remind you that God's goodness rises daily, unchanging, reliable, and personal. You take a slow step into the day, and with it comes the gentle decision to surrender. Plans swirl in your head, tasks, deadlines, worries, but you release them one by one into God's hands. Surrender doesn't mean giving up. It means trusting the author of your story more than the pressure of your own pen. You picture yourself handing over keys, not because you're careless, but because He drives the road you cannot see. In this act of letting go, you discover freedom from the need to control every outcome, freedom to breathe and rest in His guidance. Throughout history, surrender has been the posture of morning faith. Ancient believers placed offerings at dawn, laying the first fruits of their labor before God. Historians still argue whether these rituals were more symbolic or practical, but their meaning remains clear. Trust begins with release. Here's a quirky detail. Some desert monks in the 4th century tied knots into ropes each morning, then untied them at dusk, symbolizing worries handed to God and released at night. You may not tie knots, but your prayer can untangle your soul. As the light brightens, you surrender the weight of today, discovering peace in His care. You picture yourself like a tree at sunrise, roots deep in the soil, steady and nourished by unseen streams. Faith works the same way. What holds you firm is not always visible, but it sustains you when the winds of life press hard. Each morning, Scripture becomes your water source words, alive with strength, wisdom, and direction. As you recite even a single verse, it's like sunlight touching your leaves, reminding you that God's promises are constant, steady, and rooted deeper than any fear. You stand tall, not because storms are absent, but because your roots go deep into His Word. Across history, believers have clung to Scripture at dawn. The Jewish Shema was prayed each morning, declaring love for the Lord with heart, soul, and strength. Historians still argue whether this ritual was meant more as national identity or personal devotion, but its persistence speaks of faith's power. And here's a quirky tidbit. In some medieval villages, priests carried handwritten verses from house to house at sunrise, almost like spiritual newspapers, reminding families of God's truths. You don't need a priest knocking at your door now. The Bible rests close, ready for your heart. As morning unfolds, you draw from its deep well. The morning breeze brushes against your skin, almost like a whisper from those who walk this path of faith long before you. You recall the saints and early believers who woke at dawn with hearts set on God. They faced hardships, persecutions, and uncertainties, yet their mornings still began with prayer. You realize that you are part of this great tapestry, standing in a long line of souls who trusted the same faithful Lord. Their courage becomes your encouragement, reminding you that every sunrise connects you to a heritage of resilient faith. History is full of morning devotion. The Didache, one of the earliest Christian writings, encouraged believers to pray 3 times daily, often beginning at dawn. Historians still argue whether this was meant to replace Jewish customs or simply to deepen Christian identity. But its presence shows how important mornings became for the early church. Here's a quirky detail. In some parts of medieval Europe, believers rang little sunrise bells from their windows, signaling both neighbors and heaven that prayers had begun. Imagine streets echoing with tiny chimes of devotion. And now, centuries later, you echo them quietly, your heart becoming one more bell in God's symphony of faith. As the morning continues, you glance around your home and notice how peace is meant to begin right where you live. Words exchanged at the breakfast table, the tone in which you greet loved ones, even the quiet patience you offer when things feel rushed. All of these shape the atmosphere of your home. You invite God's presence into these walls, asking Him to cover every conversation with kindness and to replace tension with harmony. When His peace flows through you, it spills naturally into the lives of those closest to you, creating a home where grace becomes the daily language. Throughout history, families have sought God's blessing at the start of the day. In Jewish tradition, the Modeh Ani prayer was recited by children and adults alike upon waking, a simple act of gratitude shaping the home's rhythm. Historians still argue whether these prayers were primarily communal or personal, but they undeniably helped families live in awareness of God. Here's a quirky fact. In 18th century households, some families placed a small loaf of bread on the windowsill each morning as both a symbol of provision and a reminder to speak kindly inside. You may not place bread on your window, but your words can still nourish peace within your home today. Sooner or later, the quiet of morning gives way to the unexpected plans that shift, conversations that sting, or challenges that appear out of nowhere. Yet even in these moments, you find strength by leaning into God's steady presence. You remind yourself that peace is not the absence of problems, but the calm assurance that He is with you in the middle of them. As you face difficulties, you picture His hand guiding yours, His voice whispering courage, His Spirit filling you with calm. This is how you meet storms, not by your own willpower, but by resting in His faithfulness. History records countless believers who faced overwhelming struggles, yet rose each morning to trust God. Martin Luther often said, "I have so much to do today that I shall spend the first 3 hours in prayer." Historians still argue whether this was literal or exaggerated, but it reveals how deeply prayer anchored his response to hardship. And here's a quirky tidbit. Some 19th century sailors carved tiny crosses into the wood of their ship bunks before voyages, believing God's presence would steady them through storms. You don't need a carved cross in your pocket today. Your faith itself carves peace into your heart, guiding you through whatever challenges come. As you step into your work or daily responsibilities, the morning light follows you, and with it, the awareness that God goes before you. Every task, whether great or small, becomes an offering when you invite His presence into it. You sense His Spirit guiding your conversations, shaping your words with grace, and opening opportunities you might have missed on your own. Even in routine work, you discover a sacred rhythm, typing on a keyboard, preparing a meal, driving through traffic, all infused with purpose when done in His name. The ordinary becomes holy when you carry His peace with you. History shows that faith has always shaped the rhythm of labor. Medieval monasteries designed their entire schedules so prayer and work intertwined, ora et labora, pray and work, side by side. Historians still argue whether this balance leaned more toward discipline or spiritual formation. Yet its influence remains clear. Here's a quirky fact. In some Renaissance towns, bells rang not only for church, but also to remind bakers and smiths to pause briefly for prayer. Imagine your workplace with bells calling everyone to lift their hearts heavenward. While you may only hear email notifications, you can still pause inwardly, turning every task into worship. As you move through your day, you notice how your peace doesn't just stay with you, it begins to ripple outward. The way you greet a coworker, the patience you show to someone in line, even the smile you offer a stranger on the street. All of these become small sermons without words. Your gentle spirit becomes a witness, pointing others to the source of your calm. You may not preach with a pulpit, but with every act of kindness, you show that God's presence is real, alive, and available to anyone who longs for peace. History carries many stories of faith expressed quietly. Early Christians were often recognized in bustling markets, not by public speeches, but by how they treated widows, orphans, and strangers. Historians still argue whether these acts were primarily evangelism or survival strategies for the community, but they undeniably drew others to Christ. And here's a quirky detail. In Victorian England, some believers wore tiny mustard seed lockets as a reminder that even the smallest faith could move mountains and conversations. You may not carry a locket today, but you carry a far greater sign: God's peace alive within you, gently spilling over into the lives of those you meet. Even as the noise of the day rises, cars rushing, voices blending, deadlines pressing, you discover a sacred stillness inside. It's the kind of calm that doesn't depend on silence outside, but on God's presence within. You pause for a breath, close your eyes for a moment, and feel His peace settle like soft dew over your spirit. In that pause, worries lose their grip, and your mind clears enough to hear His gentle whisper. This stillness is your anchor, reminding you that no matter how loud the world becomes, the Lord's voice is never drowned out. Throughout history, Christians have sought stillness amid chaos. The Desert Fathers retreated to barren landscapes, believing silence opened them to God's nearness. Historians still argue whether their solitude was meant as resistance to culture or a deeper spiritual hunger, but their legacy shows the power of quiet faith. And here's a quirky tidbit. In 18th century France, some believers carried tiny silence coins in their pockets, flipping them as reminders to pause for prayer during busy days. You may not have a coin in hand, but you do have the choice to pause. In every hectic moment, you reclaim stillness, resting in the Lord's gentle presence. As the day stretches on, your prayers widen like ripples on a pond, reaching beyond yourself to embrace others. You lift up your family, your friends, and even those you may never meet, asking God's peace to rest on them too. This circle of blessing expands each time you intercede, turning your morning devotion into a river that flows outward. You realize that prayer is not limited by walls or distance. It travels on the Spirit's breath, touching hearts you cannot touch with your own hands. In blessing others, you find your own spirit refreshed, carried by love beyond measure. History reveals that communal prayer has always been central to faith. The early church gathered at sunrise, not only for personal devotion, but to intercede for widows, travelers, and rulers. Historians still argue whether these prayers shaped politics or simply sustained community hope, but their power remains undeniable. And here's a quirky fact. In some 19th century towns, children tied written prayers to kites and let them fly skyward, believing God would catch their words in the wind. You may not send a kite into the morning air, but your whispered prayer today still soars higher, lifted straight into the hands of the Father. As the sun begins to sink and the colors of evening paint the sky, you pause to look back over your day. Some moments brought joy, others carried weight, and perhaps a few left you uncertain. Yet through it all, you recognize the steady hand of God guiding, correcting, and comforting you. Reflection is not about shame, but about mercy. The chance to see where you stumbled and where He lifted you again. You whisper thanks for every lesson wrapped in grace and trust that even your mistakes are seeds He can grow into something beautiful tomorrow. For centuries, believers have ended their day with reflection. The practice of Compline, the night prayer of the church, was designed to help souls release the burdens of the day before sleep. Historians still argue whether this was more for personal rest or for community discipline, but either way, it offered peace. Here's a quirky detail. In medieval times, some families placed a bowl of water outside at dusk, symbolizing washing away the day's troubles before entering their homes. You may not place a bowl outside tonight, but you can still lay everything at God's feet, trusting His mercy to cover you fully. As night settles and tomorrow waits quietly beyond the horizon, you rest in the promise that God's love continues with you. Sleep is not just an end to the day, but a gentle rehearsal for trust, closing your eyes, letting go of control, and believing He keeps watch while you rest. The morning taught you surrender, gratitude, and stillness. The evening teaches you hope. You know that whatever tomorrow brings, whether ease or challenge, you will meet it with the same peace that carried you today, because God is faithful, steady, and never absent from your side. Throughout history, hope for tomorrow has anchored weary souls. The Psalms often speak of morning mercies and evening songs, tying each day to God's unbroken rhythm. Historians still argue whether these songs were written primarily for temple worship or personal devotion, but they reveal a trust that spans centuries. Here's a quirky fact. In the 1800s, some rural families placed fresh bread dough near the hearth overnight, believing that a rising loaf symbolized God's blessing waiting with the dawn. You may not leave dough by the fire, but you carry a greater assurance. Tomorrow is already held in His loving hands. And now, as the night grows gentle and the day closes its eyes, you let your soul breathe deeply in God's nearness. The same morning light that greeted you now softens into evening calm, and His presence has never left your side. You walk from dawn to dusk with the assurance that every breath is sheltered, every step guided, and every thought known by Him. So you rest without fear, with peace wrapping around you like a soft blanket. May God's presence surround you, His love anchor you, and His